Okay, we are on Zayin Amud Aleph 7a, and we learned in the Mishnah what happens once a woman is declared bona fide Sotah, and then we said that she's taken to the local court, at which point the first opinion, the Tanakama means the first sage of the Mishnah stated that they are accompanied by two scholars who take them to Jerusalem. And the Gemara yesterday discussed what the reasoning might be. Either the reasoning is like Rav, which said we are concerned with impropriety, and therefore we want to have not just one person, but two people there, just in case one has to go to the bathroom. No one is ever left alone with this woman. Between the three of them, husband and two witnesses, one goes to the bathroom. If there's two still there, then they're okay. And likewise, specifically scholars, in Rav's view, because if they are men of ill repute, even if you had 10 people, it would be of no use, because they're still questionable. Or the reason is simply because we want two scholars to be witnesses, just in case something might happen on the way. And they have to be scholars, not just to testify about what happened, but also to be able to warn them against the consequences of their actions along the way. That was a discussion yesterday. Now, we had another opinion in the Mishnah, which is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And that's where we are. We're about to analyze Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So we're middle of the page. There's two dots there, and here we are. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Baila Cholu, her husband, etc. The Mishnah said, Neman Allah. The husband is trusted not to be with her when they're traveling, which implies there's no need to have anybody accompany them because he's trusted. We're not concerned that he might do something. The Bezdin, the local Bezdin that sends him off to Jerusalem can tell him that you should know that if you do anything, then the Sotah is rendered invalid. And therefore he's trusted. And that's enough. So the Gemara now is going to analyze the logic behind Rabbi Yehuda's view and why it is that the sages, the first opinion that we discussed yesterday, disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. Namely, Tanya, we learned in Mishnaic age text, not the Mishnah itself, but rather from a Tosefta, Breita, which says, Rabbi Yehuda says, Baila Neman, the husband is trusted not to do anything while he's on the way with his wife, taking her to Jerusalem to drink the Sotah waters. And this is Mikava Chaimer. This trust comes from a how much to the more so, a fortiori, which is, right, one of the 13 principles. We discussed this before, the Kal and the Chaimer, when you have a weak scenario and a stronger scenario. And if the weak scenario has a certain stringency, then certainly the strong scenario has a stringency. And likewise, the reverse. If the stronger scenario has a lenience, then certainly the weaker scenario will also have that lenience. In this case, Uman Nida, just as it is with a Nida, a woman who is a married couple, who are forbidden to engage in intimacy from the moment his wife sees her period until she goes to mikvah. The general rule is she waits 5 days from once the period starts, and then 7 days, and then goes to mikvah. And after that, they can be together again. Now,
7 days from when? 7 days?
From after 5 days from when she sees her period, or after the period ends. What's rabbinic? What I just said is a common practice, but there's rabbinic, there's biblical, there's all kinds of things. But that's the bottom line. She sees her period, after the period's over, 7 days, and then mikvah. Now, during this period, when he's not allowed to be with her, she bekaris. The prohibition of being with her is the highest order of prohibition. It's a prohibition which violation of would be karet. Karet is capital punishment, but at the hands of heaven. And not just capital punishment at the hands of heaven, but capital punishment for the soul as well, whatever that means. The person's cut off. That's what karet means. It's a very strong, it's the strongest terms of punishment in Torah terms is karet. It's the highest, not just capital punishment in the court, which also there are levels, different types of capital punishment. It's death by the hands of heaven, of which there's also two different types, misa b'dei shamayim and kares. Kares is like, literally means, I think it's excision. That's the word, excision. So it's very a strong prohibition for husband and wife to be together before she's gone to mikveh. And yet, when she's in that time and they're not allowed to be together, by law, neman Allah, the husband is trusted not to be with her. We don't say that we have to have two scholars accompany them in their home to make sure they don't do anything. They live together, and even when they're not allowed to be intimate together, we trust them that they're not going to do anything. It's not as if like we appoint scholars to watch them stay in the house until she goes to mikveh to make sure nothing happens. We don't do that, right? We trust that husband and wife know the laws and they won't do anything. So in the stricter scenario, here being the Sotah, being the Nida, the woman who had her period, called Nida, the husband is trusted. So there's a leniency in the stricter scenario. Sotah, then the Sotah, which the prohibition for the husband to be with her, she belav. It's an ordinary prohibition that doesn't have this high level of excision as a consequence. It's just the prohibition. I shouldn't say the word just, but it's a prohibition rather than the nida, which is a prohibition that comes along with karas, with excision. So between these two relationships that are forbidden to him, he's not allowed to be with a nida, and he's not allowed to be with a Sotah woman, with his own wife who's a Sotah, right? This guy, a year ago when his wife was a nida, he wasn't allowed to be with her. And now that he's walking with her to Jerusalem to drink the water, he's not allowed to be with her because she's a Sotah. But these are two different prohibitions that hold him back from being with his wife. The first is nida, which is a much stronger one because it's accompanied with excision, and yet we trust him to be at home with her alone. Then how the more so with the Sotah law, which is only a prohibition, which doesn't have excision. Certainly we can trust him not to be with his wife.
What kind of punishment does it have?
It's a question what the punishment would be. I imagine the punishment would be lashes, just like every other prohibition, I think. Unless the prohibition is simply that now the Sotah is called off. I don't know. I'm going to put a pin in that. I don't know. But it's definitely not excision and definitely not capital punishment for being with his wife while she's a Sotah. Okay, so this is the Kal V'chomer. The stricter relationship, nida, he's trusted, and that's the leniency. Then that leniency of being trusted should certainly apply to the weaker for prohibition, namely the prohibition of him being with his wife, who's a Sotah. It's like it says here, Sotah, the Sotah Shibalav, which is only a prohibition, does not have excision, like Kol Shekain, is not all the more so that he should be trusted. Okay, so this is very sound logic. If a Torah trusts him to be with his wife, to live with his wife, and trusts him not to engage with her intimately, while they're prohibited on this very strict prohibition of nida, then certainly Torah trusts him not to engage with his wife when she's a Sotah. So what's the sage's counter-argument? Right? So says the Gemara, the Rabbanan and the sages who we learned about yesterday, who require scholars to accompany them as if to say, we don't trust this guy, we are concerned that he might engage with his wife. So why don't they trust him if they also trust him with nida? Right? The sage, nobody, including the sages, nobody says that when a woman's a nida, you have to have scholars in the house to make sure they're not intimate. We don't have such a thing anywhere. So why are the sages adamant that we have to have scholars accompany them when she's a Sotah? Seemingly, we have a level of trust the Torah gives him.
They have their own level of fear of having carrot. That alone is itself.
That's what the Gemara is about to say. So the Rabbanan says, "He and Isenes." The very logic you just presented actually supports our opinion, says the sages. How is that? Because the premise of your argument, Rabbi Yehuda, is that nida is a much more stringent prohibition. Because nida, the karas, nida, which is a prohibition that's accompanied with excision, chamirale is so strict, and therefore mehemen, we believe him, we trust him. The husband knows the severity of what it means to be with his wife before she's gone to mitzvah. And that's why we trust him. So this is a little hole in the arguments of the Kal V'chomer. Not always the Kal V'chomer is soundproof. In this case, you have a stricter law and a weaker law, and the stricter law has a leniency. And a Kal V'chomer would say, well, then the weaker law should also get the leniency. But the sages say, hold on a second. If the strictness itself is the reason for the leniency, then you cannot apply that leniency without the strictness. The strictness here, the fact that it's a prohibition for which there's karas, excision, that is the reason for the leniency. That's why we trust them, because of how strict it is. And if without that strictness, you can't apply the leniency. And if without the strictness of the karas, you can't trust him that he's not going to be with her. And therefore, the Sotah, the lav, which is only a prohibition, lo yichamir alei, is not such a strong prohibition, and therefore, we don't trust him not to violate it. Because he might say to himself, it's not such a big deal. Look, my wife's a nida, I'm not going to be with her then, because that's karas. But now, she my legit life, it's just a questionable thing. He'll excuse himself. And that's why we send sages. So the sages are essentially saying that an Efer Torah or Kal V'chomer only works if the stringency and leniency don't support each other. They happen to both exist in the same law. Then you can apply it. But here, the strictness itself is the reason for the leniency. And if without the strictness, you have no reason to apply the leniency. The strictness of how terrible the punishment is. It's the strictness that allows leniency. That's right, the strictness that this is a law of karas, the strictness that this is such a strong prohibition that causes excision is precisely why we're lenient and trust him, because we don't think he'll ever violate such a terrible law. But the law of the Sotah, which is not so strict, he might excuse himself and say it's not such a big deal. And that's why we send the scholars. Okay, so this is the end of the Mishnaic H text, and now comes the Gemara's commentary. Rabbi Yehuda, and is it indeed true that Rabbi Yehuda Mikal V'chomer Ma'asilei? Does Rabbi Yehuda derive this law that he trusts the husband from a Kal V'chomer, the Kal V'chomer we just described? Rabbi Yehuda says that if we trust a man to be living with his wife when she's in nida, then certainly we can trust him when he's walking to Jerusalem with his wife who's a Sotah. Now, is that the case, says the Gemara? Well, Rabbi Yehuda, we have another text where the same Rabbi Yehuda, Mikroi Ma'asilei, supports his opinion not from a Kal V'chomer, but from an actual verse. So it seems like a contradiction in the Mishnaic H text. One Mishnaic H text says, the one we just learned, says that Rabbi Yehuda derives the leniency of not requiring scholars from a Kal V'chomer, from the Efer Torah. And here we're about to quote Mishnaic text, which says that Rabbi Yehuda's position that we'll trust him, and we do not accompany, we don't send scholars to accompany them to Jerusalem. This other Mishnaic text that we're about to read derives this from a verse, not from the Efer Torah. And there's the question the Gemara is asking. So the Tanya, for we've learned in the Mishnaic H text, quoting a verse, V'hevia ish es ishtoi el hakoyin. The verse reads that the man must bring his wife to the kohen. This is the verse describing the law of the Sotah. It's part of that half a chapter which we've looked at in the past. The husband has to bring her to the kohen. So he certainly has to travel with her to Jerusalem, as prescribed right here in this verse. And therefore the Mishnah continues. Min ha-Torah, biblically speaking, ha-ish mevi es ishtoi. The man brings his wife to Jerusalem. Aval amru chachamim. But the sages say, and this is in line with the first view of our Mishnah, the sages say, we appoint two scholars to accompany them, to lest he decide to engage with her intimately. Okay, so that's the opinion of the sages, the opinion of the first opinion in our Mishnah, that two scholars are sent to accompany them to prevent them from being intimate. Okay, but this Mishnaic H text now continues. Rabbi Yossi says, Baila neman Allah, the husband is believed not to engage with her. We trust him. Mikal V'chomer, based on the Efer Torah. This is Rabbi Yossi speaking, not Rabbi Yehuda. The early Mishnaic H text put this Kal V'chomer in the mouth of Rabbi Yehuda, whereas this Mishnaic text is now putting the Kal V'chomer in the mouth of Rabbi Yossi. As it continues, Mikal V'chomer from an Efer Torah, how much the more so? Uma nida, just like nida, the woman who hasn't gone to mikvah yet. She bekares, which violating that prohibition, being intimate with her, would result in excision, and yet by la neman Allah, we still trust the husband. Sotah, then the Sotah, she belav, which the prohibition to be with her is merely a normal prohibition, without the consequence of kares, like kol shekin, much more so. That should be believed. We trust him. Okay, so this is Rabbi Yossi speaking, who says the same Kal V'chomer we mentioned earlier in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda hasn't spoken yet in this Mishnah text, but let's see. It continues. Amrulai. Now the sages who said, we do send two scholars to accompany them to prevent them from being intimate, they said to Rabbi Yehuda, to Rabbi Yossi, they say to no, your Kal V'chomer is faulty. Your A4 Torah is faulty. Because the reason why, here's another reason why we trust, this is another reason why the sages say we trust the husband to be alone with his wife who's in Nida, even though it's a prohibition of excision. Why? He will be permitted to her. In other words, like this. A husband is trusted to be alone with his wife who's in Nida because he knows, I'll hold myself in for 2 weeks and then I'll be with her. So because he knows it's becoming available to him later, we trust him that he can hold himself in. There's something about the fact that I can never get it that makes me want it even more. But in the case of the Nida, I'll wait a week, wait 2 weeks, whatever it is. She'll go to mikvah and I'll be with her. So I'm not so, it's not like I can contain myself. But it's not the same it's not the same for the Sotah. Time or Sotah, but when it comes to the Sotah, she'ein laheter. It's quite possible they'll never be able to be together again. So when he's going with her to Jerusalem, he's looking at her and he's thinking, this might be my last opportunity to be with her. And that's why we don't trust him to be with her. Because he may actually want to be engaged, he may want to physically engage with her, thinking to himself, this is my last opportunity. So when it comes to the Nida, we trust, even though it's true, it's a more strict prohibition, a prohibition which is accompanied with excision of kares. It's a major prohibition, but the guy can hold himself in because, okay, in a week from now I'll be with her. But when it comes to the Sotah, he's walking down the street, he's walking down to Jerusalem, and he looks at her, they're staying in a hotel overnight somewhere on the way, and he looks at her and says, and he thinks to himself, this might be my last opportunity. And that's why we send along two scholars. So this is another counter argument to the Kal V'chomer. A different reason. The first counter argument to the Kal V'chomer was that the strictness of this Nida itself is what prevents him. And the leniency of the Sotah is what makes him think it's no big deal. Now the second counter argument is that we are scared that he's going to think to himself this is his last opportunity. I will never be able to do this again. And therefore we don't trust him because he might actually want to do it. Whereas when it comes to Nida, even if he really wants to be with his wife, he can wait a week. Now, V'omer, the Mishnah quotes a verse which backs up this idea that people have an attraction to that which they can't get. The verse reads, Mayim genuvim yumtaku. Stolen waters are sweeter. Stolen. Waters that a person stole. Things that you can't have is what you want. There's an expression for it in English. That which you can't have is what people always want. And this is the verse which states that. Stolen waters is sweeter. Water stays the same whether you stole it or whether you paid for it. But there's something about something you can't have that adds to desirability. And that's why this person may want to be with his wife when she's a Sotah, thinking, this is my last chance. I'll never be able to do this again. Okay, so all of this, so far, is not a direct contradiction to anything we said earlier. There's two different counter arguments to the Kal V'chomer. That's fine. We had two people saying the Kal V'chomer. The first Mishnaic text quoted Rabbi Yehuda saying the Kal V'chomer, and this Mishnaic text has Rabbi Yossi saying the Kal V'chomer. But now this same Mishnaic text continues and quotes Rabbi Yehuda, but in a completely different manner. Rabbi Yehuda says, Min HaTorah, biblically speaking, Ha'ish mevis ishtai, the husband brings his wife elakayin to the husband. Shenemar, the verse reads, the verse we quoted earlier, Vehevia ishis ishtai, the man shall bring his wife. So here, Rabbi Yehuda is saying the reason why you don't send scholars is because the verse doesn't say so. Because biblically, the husband has to do it. So here, Rabbi Yehuda is not saying a Kal V'chomer. He's saying it from the verse. Because the verse says that only he brings her, and the verse makes no mention of anybody else. So we leave it at the biblical mandate. So Rabbi Yehuda in this Mishnaic text is not relying on Kal V'chomer. If we trust him by Nida, we also trust him by Sotah. Here Rabbi Yehuda is saying simply, the verse says he brings her. So that's it. He brings her. Done. Nobody else. Now if that's the case, why does Rabbi Yehuda in the other Mishnaic age text quote a Kal V'chomer?
Is the same Rabbi Yehuda?
Same Rabbi Yehuda speaking. Sometimes the Gemara will say that the two texts are different Rabbi Yehudas. but we try to avoid that kind of thing. Because the rule in general is lafushim machlekes afashinon, which is, the rule is, in Gemara, we always try to avoid conflict if we can. If we're left with no choice, but that there are two different opinions, we'll go with two different opinions. But if we can somehow reconcile the opinions, we'd rather do that. So rather than saying there's a two Rabbi Yehudas and now adding another opinion, we'll try to sit to the same person speaking. And this is how the Gemara says it. We have to see these two Mishnayos as a sequence of events. It begins with a Kal V'chomer. Rabbi Yehuda begins his position by saying Kal V'chomer. If we trust, like the first Mishnah text which we read, if we trust them for Anida, we certainly trust them for Sotah. Bereisha, that was in the outset. But Upirchuha, but they counter-argued him. They counter-argued his Kal V'chomer on two accounts. First, they counter-argued him, the first Mishnah, by saying that the strictness is what prevents him by the Nida, and the leniency by the Sotah is what will make him be careless. And then they counteracted today, or the next Mishnah text, which says that the Sotah is something he may never be able to get again. There are two different scenarios. The Nida, he can control himself because he knows he can be with her in a week. Whereas the Sotah, he has a harder time controlling himself because he thinks to himself, I'll never get this again. And because the stolen waters, and because the sages counteracted him, then he went with the reverse and said, and quoted the verse, because they undermined his Kal V'chomer, therefore he decided to go with the verse. In other words, his opinion remains his opinion. He just, I guess he felt this is, or he has it by tradition, that the correct way is not to send scholars. So first he thought maybe the reason is Kal V'chomer, and then when they dismantled that logic, he used the verse to support his idea.
So that was refuted. That was outright dismissed. It was refuted.
Sorry?
It was formally refuted.
Yes, so so it seems like the Kal V'chomer is formally refuted, but Rabbi Yehuda is still going with the verse. Yes. Now the Gemara says like this. The Gemara makes just a point, which we kind of already answered, but because I already read the Gemara ahead, but let's just see. Rabbi Yehuda Hainu Tanakama. The literal reading in the last text we just quoted, all Rabbi Yehuda says is that biblically speaking, all you have to do is bring the husband, bring the wife. And the Gemara asks, the original sage said the same thing. The original sage also said that biblically all he has to do is bring her. But the scholars, the sages added that the sages enacted that you have to add two scholars. Rabbi Yehuda never said anything directly to counteract that. All he said was, biblically he has to bring her. And I correctly, based on the Gemara's thing, interpreted to say that it stops there without any additions. But the Mishnah doesn't say so clearly. And if the Gemara asks, well, all Rabbi Yehuda said was the first half of what the original sages said. The original sages of the Brisa said that biblically he has to bring her, and that the sages enacted that the scholars should bring her, fine. And Rabbi Yehuda just said the first half, that biblically he has to bring her. So where's his argument?
There's no argument, right? They both agree biblically.
They both agree biblically. And if the Gemara says no, Ika Banaya, there is a dispute, and this is, as we explained earlier, Aval Amru. The second half, where the sages said that there's a rabbinic commandment or a rabbinic instruction to accompany her with scholars, that Rabbi Yehuda is rejecting and saying we stick just with the biblical mandate. Okay, so in conclusion, we have is.
So he's just disputing the rabbinic.
He's
instruction.
Yeah, he's not disputing it or negating it. Yeah. So we have essentially two opinions. We have two opinions, and a few different ways to come to these different opinions. The two opinions are: do you send scholars to accompany them or not? So let's begin with the opinion that says we send scholars. The opinion that says that we send two scholars to accompany them, that we discussed yesterday, either one of two reasons. Either because we're worried of impropriety, we want to have two scholars to make sure that he's not engaged intimately, and that if one of them goes to the bathroom, the other one's not engaged, God forbid, alone with her. And therefore we have to have three total, husband and two scholars. And they must be scholars so that they can, and they have to be scholars, because if they aren't scholars, if they are men of ill repute, even 10 wouldn't be enough. One way of thinking about that. The other way of thinking about that is, no, we're sending scholars just to be witnesses, to make sure that they don't engage, to testify should they become intimate, and to warn him against being intimate, letting him know that if you are intimate, you're going to undermine the Sotah. Those are two ways of understanding the first view, which is that we send two scholars. The second view, which is you do not have to send 2 scholars. The husband can take him alone to Jerusalem. And that was today's discussion, and 2 ways of coming to that conclusion as well. Either kal v'chomer, if we trust him to be alone with his wife while she's in Nida, if we trust him to be alone with his wife before she's gone to mikvah, when there is the prohibition for which the consequence would be excision, we still trust him. How much more so we'll trust him with a Sotah, which is not such a strong prohibition. That's one way of coming to this conclusion, that you don't need to have scholars. We trust him just like we trust him at his home with his wife when she's in Nida. Another way of coming to the same conclusion is the verse. The verse says he takes her, period. The verse makes no mention of anybody else, and therefore leave it at that. Those are the 2 ways of understanding this other law. And it would seem that the kal v'chomer was undermined on 2 accounts. Number 1, the fact that we trust him by a nida is precisely because it's strict, because he's scared of doing such a violation for which is excision. But the Sotah law, he might excuse himself and say it's not such a big deal. Number 1. Number 2, with the nida, he will contain himself because he knows he has in a week from now he can be with her. Whereas with the Sotah, he has this stolen water here. He has this thing that he'll never be able to get again. And therefore he might actually want to engage. So this concludes this part of the description of the Sotah, which is the Sotah traveling from her hometown to Jerusalem. And now the next section of the Gemara is going to get into what happens once they are in Jerusalem. Now what do they do? Right? We're going slowly. First we began with the warning, then we went to the seclusion. We went to how many witnesses need to be there at the warning, how many witnesses have to be at the seclusion. We went into discussion to make sure that we know nothing about her intimacy, because if we did, that would undermine the Sotah. Now that we know that she's a Sotah, we continued with bringing her to the local court, and then from the local court to Jerusalem. The last 2 days we discussed that travel. Do they have to have 2 scholars, not 2 scholars? And then, God willing, going forward, now that they're in Jerusalem, what do we do now? And then we're going to talk about how we bring her to the high court, how we bring her to the temple, how she drinks the waters, and so on and so forth. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
God bless you. Yeshikoach. All the very best to you all. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Alan. Have a good day.